Tonight, we revisit 3 cases drawn from the historical record of Victorian Britain. 3 investigations, 3 open verdicts, 3 records that were never closed. The case of Eliza Grimwood begins in Lambeth, Surrey, in the spring of 1838. The district of Lambeth at that time occupied the south bank of the Thames within the Metropolitan Police District, connected to the northern bank of the river by Waterloo Bridge, which had been opened to the public in 1817. The Waterloo Road ran south from the bridge approach through a neighbourhood of mixed character, its streets holding modest residential dwellings, public houses, entertainment venues, and lodging houses of varying quality. London's population stood at approximately 1,900,000 persons in 1838 and was increasing at a considerable rate. The Metropolitan Police had been established in 1829 and covered the Lambeth district through its L Division, the force still only 9 years old at the time of these events. Gas lighting had been installed along the principal thoroughfares of the capital by this date, though the residential streets running off the Waterloo Road were not uniformly lit after dark. Wellington Terrace was a short residential street adjoining the Waterloo Road, its terrace houses representing a standard of domestic accommodation, somewhat above the common lodging house, and consistent with the circumstances of tradespeople and others of comparable standing in the district. Eliza Grimwood was approximately 26 years of age at the time of her death in May of 1838. Her precise date of birth and her place of origin have not been established in the surviving formal record. The proceedings of the coroner's inquest and the newspaper coverage of the case offer no documentary evidence of her family background, her parentage, or her origins outside London. The record does not name her parents, her siblings, or any family member other than the cousin with whom she shared the lodgings at Wellington Terrace. She was unmarried, and she had no documented connection to a husband or legal guardian. In the formal archive, she appears primarily as a resident of 12 Wellington Terrace, Waterloo Road, Lambeth, and as the subject of a coroner's inquiry convened in the weeks following her death. The absence of any named family network in the documentary record was itself a feature of the case, as it has survived in the sources. Her occupation was that of a courtesan. She occupied furnished lodgings at 12 Wellington Terrace, an address that placed her in circumstances of relative comfort by comparison with the most exposed and precarious levels of the trade in the Waterloo Road district. The house contained multiple rooms and was maintained as a settled domestic establishment rather than a common lodging house. She shared the premises with her cousin, identified in the inquest record as William Hubbard. The precise nature of the domestic arrangement between Eliza Grimwood and Hubbard was not definitively established in the formal proceedings. Whether Hubbard managed her affairs, served in some protective capacity, or was simply a relative sharing the same address is not clearly documented in the sources. He was present in the house on the night of the murder and gave evidence at the subsequent inquest as the principal witness from within the household regarding the events of that evening. The Waterloo Road district in late May of 1838 was a neighbourhood in which the ordinary commerce of working London coexisted with its more precarious populations. Saturday evenings brought considerable movement through the area. The audiences of theatrical venues, the customers of public houses and taverns, tradespeople concluding their working week, and those whose occupations brought them into the streets of South London after dark. Women in the occupation that Eliza Grimwood practiced moved through this population in the ordinary course of their evenings, making their way toward the entertainment districts north of the river where clients were to be sought among the evening crowds. If you find value in histories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, back to the record. On the evening of Saturday, the 25th of May, 1838, Eliza Grimwood departed from the 12th of Wellington Terrace and went out into the streets of the Waterloo Road district. Witnesses who subsequently gave evidence at the coroner's inquest placed her in the company of a man at some point during that evening. The man was described to the Metropolitan Police in the days following the discovery of the body as well dressed. presenting the appearance of a person of some social standing and of a dark complexion. Witnesses characterized his appearance as foreign-looking, and some offered descriptions suggesting a Spanish, Italian, or possibly Portuguese origin, though no such identification was ever established in the formal record. The press accounts of the case in the days and weeks that followed refer to this individual consistently as the foreign gentleman, a formulation reflecting both the language of the witness testimony and the conventions of newspaper reporting on criminal matters of the period. Whether that description accurately captured the appearance of the person responsible for the crime cannot be verified from the surviving evidence. Eliza Grimwood returned to 12th Wellington Terrace on the Saturday evening, accompanied by the man whose description was to become the primary identifying detail available to the investigation. He was admitted to the house. William Hubbard and the other members of the household were present in the premises during the period of the visitor's stay, either in other rooms or in a state of sleep. The precise hour at which the visitor arrived and the hour at which he subsequently departed were not established with precision in the testimony of those present. No witness was in a position to observe what occurred in the private rooms of the house during the hours that followed. The attack that took place in Eliza Grimwood's bedroom was not heard or was not attended to by any other person in the house that night. The body of Eliza Grimwood was found on the morning of Sunday, the 26th of May, 1838. The discovery was made within the household by William Hubbard and at least one other occupant of the house, identified in some accounts of the case as a woman named Catherine Edwin, though the name and identity of this individual cannot be confirmed with full confidence against the primary inquest record. The condition in which the body was found established the cause of death without ambiguity. Eliza Grimwood's throat had been cut. The wound was described in the medical evidence subsequently presented at the inquest and in the press reporting of the proceedings as severe in the extreme. An incised injury to the throat inflicted with considerable force and causing a fatal loss of blood. Contemporary accounts characterise the wound as nearly decapitating in its extent, indicating the use of a bladed instrument and an attack of a sustained and violent character. The alarm was raised within the household. The Metropolitan Police were notified the same morning, and officers of L Division attended the premises at 12 Wellington Terrace in the course of Sunday, the 26th. The case attracted prompt attention from both the police and the press, given the severity of the violence and the character of the district. By the close of the morning of the 26th of May, the events at Wellington Terrace had become the subject of an active police inquiry and would shortly become the subject of extensive newspaper coverage across the London press. The discovery of the body on the morning of the 26th of May ended the account of Eliza Grimwood's life, as the surviving record has preserved it. What remained was the formal process of inquiry, a police investigation, a coroner's inquest, and the attempt to establish the identity of the man who had entered the house at Wellington Terrace on the Saturday evening and had departed before the household rose on the Sunday morning. The investigation was formally opened under the direction of Inspector Pelham of the Metropolitan Police, L Division, identified in secondary accounts of the case as the officer who led the ground-level inquiry into the murder. His given name has not been confirmed with full confidence in the available sources, and verification against the primary inquest depositions would be required to establish his precise designation. Officers were dispatched to the premises, and statements were taken from those present in the household. William Hubbard was questioned regarding Eliza Grimwood's movements on the evening of the 25th of May, the description and identity of the male visitor who had accompanied her to Wellington Terrace, and the events of the night as Hubbard had observed them. Hubbard confirmed that a man had entered the house with Eliza Grimwood, and that he could not provide a name for the visitor. Witnesses were interviewed in the days that followed. Officers canvassed the Waterloo Road district and made inquiries at the public houses, entertainment establishments, and other venues that Eliza Grimwood was known to have frequented. An appeal was issued for information relating to the man of dark complexion and respectable appearance who had been seen in her company on the Saturday evening and who had accompanied her to 12 Wellington Terrace. Evidence was collected and recorded in preparation for the formal proceedings before the Surrey coroner. The investigation sought to trace the foreign gentleman through the network of venues and individuals associated with Eliza Grimwood's working life in the district. The investigation proceeded under conditions of significant practical limitation. In 1838, the Metropolitan Police possessed no formal detective branch. The detective department would not be established until 1842, 4 years after the events at Wellington Terrace, and the investigative tools available to Inspector Pelham and his colleagues were the tools of a uniformed constabulary. Witness interviews, neighbourhood canvassing, and the dissemination of the description of the suspect. There was no forensic science in any modern sense. The identification of the person responsible for Eliza Grimwood's death depended on what witnesses in her social world were prepared to say to police officers. The particular nature of her occupation placed a further constraint on the inquiry. The client network that brought men to 12 Wellington Terrace was by its nature anonymous and private, and those who had knowledge of the men she encountered in the course of her working life had reasons of their own to keep that knowledge from the police. The investigation found no passage through that anonymity. The inquiry had proceeded through its available avenues without producing an identified suspect. Inspector Pelham's enquiries had covered the neighbourhood, collected testimony from within the household, and circulated the description of the foreign gentleman of dark complexion and respectable dress. They had not produced a name. William Hubbard, whose presence in the house on the night of the murder brought him under initial scrutiny, was questioned and cleared of any involvement. No other individual was established as a person of interest against whom sufficient evidence existed to proceed. The man who had accompanied Eliza Grimwood to 12th Wellington Terrace on the Saturday evening of the 25th of May, 1838, was not found. A post-mortem examination was conducted in the days following the discovery of the body, in accordance with the procedure required by the coroner's inquiry. The examining physician, a local surgeon whose identity has not been established with full confidence in the sources available for this account, examined the body and produced findings for the formal record. The cause of death was determined to be a severe incised wound to the throat, consistent with the use of a bladed instrument and resulting in a fatal hemorrhage. The character and extent of the wound established the death as a homicide beyond any question. The severity of the injury was such that it admitted no interpretation consistent with accident or self-infliction. These findings were entered into the official record and provided the medical foundation for the proceedings before the coroner. The time of death was placed by medical opinion at some point during the night of Saturday, the 25th of May, or the early hours of Sunday the 26th, a range consistent with the account given by household witnesses of the visitor's presence in the house and his departure before the body was discovered the following morning. The medical findings did not contradict any aspect of the narrative established through the police inquiry. What the examination could confirm, it confirmed without reservation. What it could not establish was the identity of the person who had inflicted the fatal wound. That question passed to the proceedings of the coroner's inquest. An inquest was convened before the Surrey coroner in the weeks following the discovery of the body at Wellington Terrace. The presiding coroner is identified in some secondary accounts of the case as Mr. Carter, though this identification cannot be confirmed with full confidence against the primary record and should be verified against the Surrey coroner's records for the period. The proceedings were held in late May and the early weeks of June 1838 in accordance with the established practice of the Victorian inquest system. Testimony was taken under oath from the principal witnesses available to the inquiry. William Hubbard, who gave evidence regarding Eliza Grimwood's movements on the evening of the 25th of May and the presence of the male visitor at Wellington Terrace, other members and associates of the household, neighbours who had been in a position to observe events in the vicinity of Wellington Terrace on the Saturday night, and Inspector Pelham and his colleagues from L Division, who gave evidence of the police inquiry and the steps taken in the attempt to identify the suspect. The testimony presented at the inquest established the chronology of the evening of the 25th of May, the character and appearance of the male visitor, as described by those who had observed him, the domestic arrangements at 12 Wellington Terrace, and the circumstances of the discovery of the body on the Sunday morning. The description of the foreign gentleman was entered into the formal record through the evidence of witnesses who had seen him in Eliza Grimwood's company. No witness was able to provide the man's name or any identifying detail beyond the physical description already held by the police. Inspector Pelham gave evidence of the inquiries conducted by L Division and of the failure of those inquiries to produce an identified suspect. The jury returned a verdict of willful murder by person or persons unknown. No named individual was committed for trial, and no committal hearing followed. The inquest verdict was the formal conclusion of the legal proceedings connected with the death of Eliza Grimwood. It was the only formal conclusion those proceedings would ever reach. The record of the inquiry, as it now survives, consists principally of the newspaper accounts of the proceedings published in the Times, the Morning Chronicle, the Morning Post, and the Sunday Press of late May and June 1838, these being the primary sources through which the case has been preserved in the documentary record. The verdict closed the formal proceedings. It did not produce an arrest, a charge, or a named individual held accountable for what had occurred at 12 Wellington Terrace on the night of the 25th of May, 1838. The case ended where the inquest ended, at a finding of willful murder by person or persons unknown, with the person or persons in question unidentified. The death of Eliza Grimwood generated extensive press coverage in the weeks following the discovery of the body at Wellington Terrace. The Times, the Morning Chronicle, the Morning Herald, and the Morning Post reported on the inquest proceedings across multiple issues in May and June of 1838, and Lloyd's weekly newspaper and the Sunday Press gave the case considerable prominence in a more sensational register. The combination of the victim's occupation, the extreme violence of the injury, and the unresolved identity of the suspect made the case a natural subject for the popular press of the period. Whether the murder generated broadside ballads, as the violent and sensational crimes of that era commonly did, is probable but cannot be confirmed from any specific surviving titles. The case entered the subsequent literature of Victorian crime history and the histories of the early Metropolitan Police as an instance of the investigative limitations of the pre-detective era, and it appears in specialist accounts of that period as one of the prominent unsolved murders of the opening decades of the force's existence. It did not achieve the lasting national prominence of the famous Victorian murders that followed in subsequent decades, and by the middle years of the century it had receded from general public consciousness. The case of Eliza Grimwood is significant in the historical record of the Metropolitan Police as an illustration of the structural limitations that confronted the force in its earliest years. In 1838, the Metropolitan Police possessed no trained detective capacity, no forensic science, and no institutional mechanism for penetrating the anonymity of the client networks associated with the victim's occupation. The investigation could proceed only as far as the willingness of witnesses to speak, and as far as the physical description of a man already gone from the neighbourhood would carry it. That was not far enough. The absence of a formal detective branch meant that the inquiry lacked the tools and the institutional framework to pursue a suspect who had left no name, no address, and no traceable connection to the victim beyond the brief encounter documented by witnesses who themselves had little reason to assist the police. The case passed into the archive. The man described as the foreign gentleman of dark complexion and respectable dress departed from 12 Wellington Terrace on the night of the 25th of May, 1838, and was not seen again in any record that has survived. The Waterloo Road continued as it had before. The house at Wellington Terrace continued to stand. The question of who had been admitted to that house on a Saturday evening and had left before dawn was never answered. No arrest was ever made. The investigation was formally closed. The case remains open. The record remains incomplete. The case of Florence Bravo begins at the Priory, Balham, Surrey, in the spring of 1876. Balham at that time was an expanding southern suburb of London, connected to the centre of the city by the railway and increasingly favoured by the prosperous middle classes as an address that offered suburban space and domestic scale within reasonable distance of the commercial districts north of the river. The Priory was a substantial villa set within its own grounds, with a garden and stables, a property of a kind that represented solid upper middle class comfort rather than aristocratic grandeur. The surrounding streets of Balham in 1896 held the villas of solicitors, physicians, merchants, and those of comparable income and social position. The houses were substantial. The gardens were maintained. The households employed servants. It was a neighbourhood of the respectable and the materially comfortable, and it was not a neighbourhood in which a case of suspected poisoning, a public inquest of 23 sitting days, and the exposure of the private lives of every member of a household were expected to have their origin. Florence Bravo was approximately 30 years of age in the spring of 1876. She had been born Florence Campbell, the daughter of a prosperous family with connections to a country estate at Booscote in Oxfordshire. Her first marriage, to Captain Alexander Lewis Ricardo of the Grenadier Guards, had been a domestic failure of a prolonged and documented kind. Ricardo was an alcoholic whose conduct through the course of the marriage made the arrangement untenable, and Florence had pursued a separation. In the early years of the 1870s, she had come under the care of Dr. James Manby Gully, a practitioner of hydrotherapy at Great Malvern, whose reputation and clientele placed him among the most distinguished figures of Victorian alternative medicine. During the period of her residence at Great Malvern, Florence entered into a romantic relationship with Gully. He was a man in his early 60s, separated, though not divorced from his wife. The relationship continued for a period of several years. Captain Ricardo died in April of 1871, leaving Florence a widow with an income of approximately £2,000 per year. She was financially independent, in control of her own property and affairs, and she remained so for as long as she remained unmarried. The relationship with Gully eventually concluded, and Florence Campbell returned to the circle of respectable London society, apparently at the urging of her family. In December of 1875, Florence Campbell married Charles Delaunay Turner Bravo, a practising barrister of approximately 30 years of age. The marriage had an immediate and legally consequential effect. Under the law, as it then stood, Florence's financial independence passed to her husband at the moment of the marriage. Charles Bravo moved to exercise the authority that the law had given him. He reduced the allowances Florence had previously maintained for her own use. He questioned and reviewed the household expenditure. He examined the role of Mrs. Jane Cannon Cox within the household and made clear his intention to reduce or terminate that arrangement. The marriage was 5 months old in April of 1876. Florence had suffered at least one miscarriage during that period. The household at the Priory was not a settled or harmonious one. Charles Delaunay Turner Bravo had been born approximately in 1845, the son of Joseph Bravo, a wealthy merchant. He had taken the Bravo surname from his stepfather and had pursued the bar with application and ambition. Witnesses who gave evidence at the subsequent inquest described a man who was forceful and controlling in financial matters and difficult in his personal dealings within the household. The domestic character attributed to him through the inquest record was that of a man who had entered a well-appointed establishment belonging to a financially independent woman and who had, in the 5 months of his marriage, set about reducing her autonomy and asserting his own authority over every aspect of the household's affairs. Mrs. Jane Cannon Cox was a widow of dependent circumstances who had served as Florence's companion and housekeeper for several years before the marriage to Charles Bravo. She had 3 young sons. She had no income or professional position independent of Florence's patronage, and her position in the household at the Priory was the entirety of her financial security. Charles Bravo had made sufficiently clear his views of Cox's presence and her future in the household that by the spring of 1876 her situation was one of acute precariousness. The authority that Charles Bravo now exercised over the household threatened to dissolve the arrangement on which Cox's livelihood entirely depended. These facts were established in the evidence given at the subsequent inquest proceedings and formed the foundation of the motive that inquiry attributed to her as a person of interest in the events of April 1876. The 5 months of marriage between Florence and Charles Bravo had produced a household in which financial controls had been imposed, domestic arrangements contested, and the position of Mrs. Cox made increasingly uncertain. Charles Bravo had reduced the allowances Florence had previously maintained for her own use, and had exercised a scrutiny over the household's expenditure that was documented by servants and household members, who subsequently gave evidence at the inquest proceedings. Florence had suffered a miscarriage in the early weeks of the marriage. The household at the Priory was not a settled one by the spring of 1876, and the tensions between its 3 principal members had not diminished in the months since the wedding. On the evening of Tuesday the 18th of April, 1876, the 3 members of the household dined together at the Priory. A formal dinner was served in the customary manner, with wine. Burgundy was drunk at the table, and the evidence presented at the subsequent inquiry indicated that Florence had consumed more wine at that dinner than was her usual practice. After dinner, Charles Bravo retired to his dressing room on the upper floor, and Mrs. Cox remained with Florence in the rooms below. The layout of the Priory placed Charles's dressing room adjacent to but distinct from Florence's bedroom, the sleeping arrangements of the household being those of a Victorian upper-middle-class house in which husband and wife occupied connected but separate rooms. What occurred in the minutes and hours that followed the conclusion of dinner on the evening of the 18th of April 1876 became the central question of the longest inquest proceeding in Victorian legal history. Charles Bravo was found in a state of violent illness shortly after retiring from the table. He was vomiting with extreme force. Mrs. Cox came to him. She testified subsequently that Charles had said to her at the moment of her arrival that he had taken poison and that she was not to tell Florence. The precise wording of this statement was disputed and re-examined throughout the inquest proceedings that followed, and the interpretation placed upon it varied considerably between those who heard Cox's evidence. Some took it to indicate a deliberate act of self-administration. Others held that the statement had been constructed, distorted, or placed in service of purposes that served Cox's own interests. Doctors were summoned. Dr. Harrison Moore, the local Balham physician, arrived at the Priory first and was met by Mrs. Cox, who told him of Charles's statement and identified laudanum as the suspected substance. The mention of laudanum directed the attending physicians towards signs of opiate poisoning. No such signs were present. Charles Bravo continued to suffer with a violence that alarmed all who attended him, and further physicians were called, including Dr. George Johnson of King's College Hospital, and in the days that followed, Dr. William Gull, a physician of national standing. Over 3 days of severe and sustained illness, Charles Bravo was questioned repeatedly by the doctors attending him regarding what he had taken. He denied deliberately ingesting any poison. He denied knowledge of the cause of his condition. He did not accuse any person in the household. He died at the Priory in the early morning of Friday, the 21st of April, 1876. Charles Bravo died at the Priory, having been ill for 3 days and having not named the cause of his suffering to those who attended him. The formal inquiry into his death began in the weeks that followed and would continue for considerably longer than the illness that ended his life. A brief local inquest was held following the death. The proceedings were considered by press commentators and by a significant body of public opinion to have been insufficient to the circumstances of the case. The determination reached at the first inquest regarding the cause of death was felt to leave the central questions of the matter unaddressed, and the pressure of public and press opinion contributed to the convening of a second and substantially more extensive inquiry. The second inquest into the death of Charles Delaunay, Turner Bravo, was convened in July of 1826 before William Carter, coroner for East Surrey. The proceedings extended over approximately 23 sitting days and constituted one of the longest inquest hearings in Victorian legal history. Barristers appeared on behalf of all parties with an interest in the proceedings. The Attorney General, Sir John Holker, took a central role in the examination of witnesses. Henry James, who would later be raised to the peerage as Lord James of Hereford, appeared on behalf of Mrs. Cox. The solicitor George Lewis was engaged in the interests of Florence Bravo. The second inquest functioned, in practical terms, as a public trial of individuals who had never been charged with any offence and who appeared before the inquiry under no legal compulsion to incriminate themselves. Mrs. Jane Cox gave evidence at considerable length. Her account of the statement attributed to Charles Bravo at the moment of his collapse was examined and re-examined under questioning by the barristers present, and the particulars of the account evolved across the course of her testimony in ways that drew sustained attention from those conducting the examination. Mrs. Cox disclosed, in the course of her evidence, the fact of Florence's prior relationship with Dr. James Gully. This disclosure, made in a public hearing whose proceedings were reported verbatim in The Times and in the national press, produced a sensation of the first order. The relationship between a wealthy widow and a physician of public distinction, conducted over several years at a fashionable hydrotherapy establishment, was a subject that Victorian public opinion found deeply scandalous, and the reporting of Cox's evidence placed the details of that relationship before the reading public of the nation. Florence Bravo gave evidence. She confirmed the relationship with Gully and the circumstances of her first marriage to Ricardo. She was questioned regarding the events of the evening of the 18th of April, her conduct during her husband's illness, and her knowledge of the possible cause of his condition. Her testimony was examined by the counsel present, and the public reporting of that examination made her private history the subject of national attention across the weeks of the inquest's sitting. Dr. James Gully gave evidence. He was in his late 60s at the time of the proceedings, effectively retired from professional practice, and his relationship with Florence had concluded before her marriage to Charles Bravo. He denied any involvement in the events at the Priory and denied knowledge of what had caused Charles's death. His appearance at the inquest and the public confirmation of the relationship with Florence produced consequences from which he did not recover. Dr. Thomas Stevenson, the Home Office analyst and lecturer in forensic medicine at Guy's Hospital, presented the toxicological evidence that the case required. Stevenson had conducted a thorough analysis of the stomach contents and organs of Charles Bravo and identified a large quantity of antimony, specifically antimony potassium tartrate, a compound used in veterinary preparations and present in the stable medicines of the period. The dose recovered was estimated at approximately 2 to 3 grains, substantially above the quantity established as fatal in the medical literature of the era. The identification was definitive. The cause of death was antimony poisoning. A post-mortem examination had been conducted following the death on the 21st of April, its findings subsequently submitted to the toxicological analysis that Stevenson conducted. The combination of the post-mortem findings and the toxicological analysis left no uncertainty regarding what had killed Charles Bravo. What the medical evidence could not establish was the vehicle through which the antimony had entered his body and the moment at which it had done so. Whether the poison had been introduced into the burgundy at the dinner table, into the water or other drink taken by Charles, in his dressing room after retiring, or into some other substance consumed during the course of the evening, was a question that neither the post-mortem nor the toxicological analysis was capable of answering. The medical evidence established the poison and the quantity. It could not establish the hand that had administered it. The jury returned a verdict at the conclusion of the second inquest. The finding was that Charles Delaunay Turner Bravo did not die from natural causes, but died from the effects of antimony willfully administered to him by some person or persons unknown. No individual was named. No committal for trial followed. The inquiry had produced the most extensive public examination of a suspicious death that the Victorian inquest system had generated. It had not produced a named perpetrator. The verdict was entered in the formal record before William Carter. The second inquest was concluded. 3 individuals had given evidence under oath over 3 weeks of nationally reported proceedings before counsel acting on behalf of contending interests. None had been charged. None would be charged. The case, as a matter of criminal law, was at an end. Florence Bravo did not recover her social position following the conclusion of the second inquest. She had been publicly identified as a woman who had maintained a relationship outside marriage, who had been twice widowed, and who was the primary subject of suspicion in the poisoning death of her second husband, though no charge had been brought, and no formal finding had named her. The drinking that had been documented during the marriage to Charles worsened considerably in the months that followed the inquest. She died on the 12th of September, 1878, at Southsea, Portsmouth. She was approximately 32 or 33 years of age. The formal cause of death was jaundice, resulting from chronic alcoholism. She was buried at Buscott in Oxfordshire, near her family's estate. She had been widowed twice, publicly examined at a national inquest, and was dead within 2 years of its conclusion. Mrs. Cox withdrew from public record following the proceedings. She lived into the early years of the 20th century. Her later circumstances not clearly established in the available sources. Dr. James Gully, whose name and relationship with Florence had been placed before the nation in the verbatim inquest reports of the summer of 1876, did not recover his social position. He was estranged from the professional circles of which he had been a member. He died on the 27th of March, 1883, aged 75. The Bravo case became, in the decades following the inquest, a standard point of reference in the literature of Victorian criminal history. Iseul Bridges examined the case in a study published in 1950, favouring Mrs. Cox as the most likely agent. A further substantial account appeared from John Williams in the late 1950s. James Ruddock's analysis, published in 2001, offered the most detailed modern forensic examination of the toxicological evidence and argued that the medical record placed the administration of the antimony at the dinner table, a reading which, if accepted, directed attention to Florence rather than to Cox. The case received BBC documentary treatment in the 1970s and has featured in subsequent true crime productions across television formats. It is a standard inclusion in British true crime anthologies of the 20th and 21st centuries and appears regularly in histories of Victorian marriage law and the legal position of women under coverture. The second inquest into the death of Charles Bravo stands as one of the most constitutionally unusual proceedings in Victorian legal history. A hearing before a coroner and jury, without criminal charges, without a defendant in the formal sense, and without the procedural protections of a criminal trial, exposed the private lives of its witnesses over 23 publicly reported days and produced a verdict that named no one. The case illustrates a specific limitation in the Victorian inquest system as a mechanism of criminal accountability. The coroner's hearing, however extensive, had no power to compel a charge where the evidence fell short of identification. The antimony was found. The dose was measured. The vehicle was not established. The person who administered it was not named. Florence Bravo died at 32 without a charge being brought. Mrs. Cox lived into the next century without a charge being brought. The case remained as the inquest had left it. The identity of the perpetrator was not established. No conviction followed. None was ever sought. The case of the woman found in the vault at Whitehall begins in Westminster in the autumn of 1888. The site in question was not a public building in operation, but a construction project of considerable institutional significance. The new headquarters of the Metropolitan Police, designed by the architect Richard Norman Shaw, and under active construction on the Victoria embankment since the mid-1880s. The building rose in red brick and pale stone at the edge of the Thames, its foundations sunk into the ground of Westminster in the immediate vicinity of the river. The surrounding area of Whitehall and the embankment in 1888 was the formal heart of the governmental and administrative apparatus of the nation. The offices of government, the buildings of public authority, and the open thoroughfares that connected Westminster to the city. The construction site itself was a working environment. Labourers, contractors, and tradesmen came and went in the ordinary course of the project, and the site, like most such sites in the period, was not secured against entry in any comprehensive fashion. London, in the autumn of 1888, was in a condition of heightened public anxiety that had few parallels in the Victorian period. The Whitechapel murders attributed to the individual the press had named Jack the Ripper had begun in August of that year and continued through the autumn, each new killing intensifying the public and parliamentary pressure on the Metropolitan Police to produce an identification. The Whitechapel murders and the case of the woman found in the foundations of the new Metropolitan Police headquarters were separate investigations conducted by the same force, in the same city, in the same autumn. They were not the same case. The method was different, the geography was different, and the investigative record maintains them as distinct. The same forensic physician, Dr. Thomas Bond, examined bodies in both series of cases in October of 1888, and that connection was noted in the press of the period. It did not indicate a common perpetrator. The case of the woman found in the vault at Whitehall Place is the case that follows here. The woman whose remains were found at the new Metropolitan Police headquarters in October of 1888 has not been identified. She was not identified in the weeks and months following the discovery of her remains. She has not been identified in the century and more that has passed since. Her name, her origins, her occupation, the circumstances of her life in London, and the manner in which she came to be at the location where she was killed are not known. The formal record contains no name for her, no age established with precision, no family, no parish of origin, no address. The record contains a description derived from the physical examination of what was found, a verdict, and a note that the identity of the deceased was not established. She entered the record as an unidentified female, and she has remained so. What the medical examination was subsequently able to establish was limited by the nature of the remains recovered. She was female. She was assessed to be somewhere in the range of her mid-20s to her late 30s, though this estimate varied between accounts and cannot be taken as precise. She appeared, from the condition of the remains, to have been reasonably well nourished and was probably not among the most destitute of London's female population. Her complexion was described as fair. Nothing further about her person, her history, or her circumstances in life was determinable from what was found. On the 17th of September 1888, a female arm was recovered from the foreshore of the Thames near Pimlico. At the time of its recovery, it was not immediately connected to a wider case, and the discovery was noted but not linked to any identified victim or reported disappearance. The arm was retained by the police. On the 2nd of October 1888, a workman named Frederick Windborne was engaged in labour on the construction site of the new Metropolitan Police headquarters at Whitehall Place on the Victoria embankment. In the course of his work, Windborne discovered a human torso concealed in a vault within the foundations of the building then under construction. The torso was that of a woman. It was the trunk of the body, without the head, without the arms, and without the legs. It had been placed in the vault and was wrapped in a piece of black silk fabric. The smell of decomposition had been noticed by workers on the site in the days preceding the formal discovery, and the state of the remains indicated that the torso had been in the vault for a period of some weeks before Windborne found it. The black silk wrapping was a detail that attracted particular notice in the press accounts of the discovery, a material whose presence suggested deliberate handling of the remains rather than a summary deposit, and whose association with the concealed body was an incongruity that the reporting of the period did not fail to observe. Officers of the Metropolitan Police attended the site, the construction works were examined, and further searches were conducted in and around the foundations, and in the Thames in the days that followed. The arm recovered near Pimlico on the 17th of September was subsequently associated by investigators with the torso found on the 2nd of October, though the connection rested on inference rather than definitive identification. A leg recovered from the Thames during this period was associated by some investigators with the same victim, though the attribution was not established beyond doubt in the formal record. The head was not found. Despite the extent of the search conducted by officers and workmen, the head of the woman, whose torso had been placed in the vault at Whitehall, was never recovered. The absence of the head was the single most consequential fact of the investigation. In 1888, facial recognition was the primary, and in practical terms the only reliable mechanism by which the identity of an unknown deceased person could be established. The head had been removed from the body. Its deliberate absence from the remains deposited at Whitehall and its apparent disposal by other means or at other locations indicated a degree of premeditation regarding the prevention of identification. Without the head, the body could not be named. Without a name, the investigation had no starting point from which to proceed into the victim's social world, her last known movements, or the circumstances that had brought her into contact with the person who had killed her. The discovery at the Whitehall site was accompanied by a search for further remains, and by an inquiry into the circumstances of the deposit. No witness had observed the placement of the torso in the vault. No description of a suspect was ever obtained. No member of the public came forward with information regarding an unaccounted-for woman in their neighbourhood or household whose disappearance in September or October of 1888 might have corresponded with the victim. The particular circumstances of women who lived outside stable domestic and parochial structures in late Victorian London meant that an unidentified woman could cease to appear in her usual circumstances without any formal record of her absence being made. The investigation had no name to pursue and no starting point from which to pursue one. The investigation was conducted by officers of the Metropolitan Police, whose Criminal Investigation Department held responsibility for serious crimes of this nature in the Westminster district. The specific officer formally charged with the conduct of the Whitehall inquiry is not established with confidence in the sources available for this account. The Metropolitan Police in October of 1888 were under severe public and parliamentary pressure. The Whitechapel murder investigation had produced no arrest and no identified suspect in the months since August, and each successive killing had deepened the crisis of confidence in the force's leadership. The discovery of a dismembered female body in the foundations of the New Scotland Yard building was a fact of acute institutional embarrassment for the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, who was already the subject of sustained criticism from the press and from Parliament regarding his handling of the Whitechapel inquiry. The theory that the perpetrator had some knowledge of or access to the construction site at Whitehall was considered by the police, given the specificity of the location chosen for the deposit of the torso. The building works were accessible to those employed on the site and to those with sufficient familiarity with the project to enter without attracting attention. Whether the person responsible was among the workforce, an individual with some other connection to the site, or a person who had identified the particular vault as a location of concealment through observation and familiarity was not determined. The deliberate removal of the head, the distribution of body parts across different locations and over an extended period, and the wrapping of the torso in fabric all indicated methodical behaviour on the part of the perpetrator rather than a disorganised or impulsive act. The planning evident in the disposal of the remains was not matched by any evidence that led investigators toward the person responsible for it. The inquiry had proceeded through its available avenues without producing an identified suspect. The absence of any witness account placing an individual at the site, The absence of any identified victim whose disappearance could be traced and whose connections could be canvassed, and the deliberate suppression of the one feature of the body most likely to have permitted identification combined to leave the investigation without a viable direction of inquiry. The police could establish where the remains had been found and when. They could not establish who had placed them there, who the woman was, or what had brought her to that end. A post-mortem examination was conducted by Dr. Thomas Bond, divisional, police surgeon and consulting surgeon to the Metropolitan Police. Bond was simultaneously involved in the Whitechapel murder investigation during the same weeks and was among the most experienced forensic physicians available to the Metropolitan Police in 1888. His examination of the torso produced the findings entered into the formal record. The victim was female. Her age was estimated within a range extending from the mid-20s to the late 30s, the precision of the estimate limited by the condition and incompleteness of the remains. She appeared reasonably well nourished and in physical condition not consistent with extreme destitution. Her complexion was fair. The dismemberment of the body, in Bond's assessment, indicated planning and some degree of anatomical knowledge on the part of the perpetrator, though it did not require the skill of a trained surgeon or physician. It was not the work of a person entirely without relevant knowledge, but neither did it demand a medical or surgical qualification as a precondition. The cause of death could not be determined. No wound on the torso indicated the mechanism by which the woman had died. No injuries of the kind that might survive the separation of the trunk from the head, and limbs provided evidence of a fatal assault. The head, which was the most probable location of any evidence of a blow, a ligature mark, or other injury of a kind that might have caused or contributed to death, was not present. Bond's examination was comprehensive within the limits of what the recovered remains permitted. Those limits precluded a determination of cause of death entirely. The finding was entered into the formal record accordingly. An inquest was held before the Westminster coroner, identified in accounts of the case as Dr. John Troutbeck, though this attribution carries only moderate confidence and should be verified against the primary record. The proceedings took place in the late weeks of October and the early days of November, 1888. The evidence presented at the inquest established what the investigation and the medical examination had produced. A female torso found in the vault of a building under active construction on the Victoria embankment, associated by investigators with an arm recovered from the Thames in September of the same year, the victim unidentified, the cause of death undetermined, and no suspect identified at any point in the proceedings. The jury returned an open verdict. The identity of the deceased was not established. The inquest concluded without resolution because the fundamental facts necessary to a determination of guilt were not in the possession of the court, and were not in the possession of the investigators who had preceded it. The discovery at the Whitehall construction site received substantial press coverage in October and November of 1888, though the simultaneous Ripper murders in Whitechapel continued to command the dominant attention of the national press and the reading public throughout the autumn of that year. The Whitehall case was discussed in the shadow of the larger sensation, and press commentators speculated on a connection between the two series of killings, the coincidence of timing and geography being sufficient to sustain that speculation through the autumn. The investigations themselves treated the two series as separate matters, and subsequent historical analysis has maintained that distinction. In the decades that followed, the Whitehall case has been examined as one instance within the broader series of Thames torso murders of the late 1880s, which includes the Rainham case of 1887 and the Pinchin Street case of 1889 as distinct events. Philip Sugden's comprehensive account of the Ripper era gave careful and separate treatment to the torso cases, maintaining the analytical distinction between the two series. Later writers, including R. Michael Gordon, have examined the torso murders as a distinct phenomenon. The Whitehall case has not achieved the individual cultural prominence of the Bravo poisoning or other famous Victorian criminal cases, but it has been periodically revisited in studies of Victorian forensic history and in accounts of the Metropolitan Police in its period of late 19th century crisis. The case of the woman found in the vault at the New Scotland Yard is historically significant for several reasons that have nothing to do with who she was, since that question was never answered. The location of the discovery produced an institutional embarrassment for the Metropolitan Police that the press of the period was not slow to exploit. A murdered and dismembered woman's remains found in the foundations of the force's own new headquarters, during the period in which the Whitechapel investigation stood as the most public failure of the Victorian police. Sir Charles Warren resigned as Metropolitan Police Commissioner on the 8th of November 1888 in the aftermath of the final Whitechapel killing and in the context of the wider collapse of confidence in his leadership. The Whitehall discovery was one element of a period of institutional pressure that would shape the subsequent development of the Metropolitan Police in the years that followed. Dr. Thomas Bond's concurrent involvement in both the Whitechapel and the Whitehall investigations makes him a significant figure in the history of Victorian forensic medicine. His post-mortem examination of the torso at Whitehall and his forensic work on the Ripper victims in the same weeks represent the extent of what forensic examination could accomplish in 1888 and the limits against which even the most experienced practitioners worked. At Whitehall, those limits were complete. The remains did not permit a cause of death to be established, and without a cause of death, the inquiry into who was responsible had no medical foundation on which to rest. The permanent anonymity of the woman whose torso was found by Frederick Windborne on the 2nd of October 1888 is the fact on which the case ultimately rests. The deliberate removal of the head was an act that achieved its purpose entirely. She was not named at the inquest. She has not been named since. The record contains what the examination of her remains produced and what the police inquiry was able to establish from the site and the circumstances of discovery. It contains nothing about her life before the September of 1888, the people she knew, the place she lived, or the circumstances that brought her to the vault in the foundations of Scotland Yard. The archive holds the post-mortem findings, the inquest verdict, and the press accounts of the weeks that followed. It holds no name. The case of the woman found in the vault at Whitehall closes the record of these three cases. The case file was closed without resolution. No suspect was charged. The record remained as it stood.